Hello and welcome back to IBreak's new episode about properties of water biology. Let's start on the general properties of bonds in water molecules. Water is obviously very essential for organisms to survive in the nature, as it fulfills many roles that we'll talk about later on this presentation. So, one key factor in water is the slightly negative and slightly positive characters of the hydrogens and oxygen in water molecules. This occurs due to the electronegative character of oxygen and its ability to pull more electrons to it, causing it to be slightly negative compared to the hydrogens, although they're all technically nonmetals. Furthermore, although the hydrogens in the water molecule create covalent bonds with oxygens, when hydrogen bonds bond with other water molecules, they actually bond with their oxygen and create hydrogen bonds, which are slightly weaker than the covalent bonds that are present in water molecules, because to begin with, covalent bonds are the strongest bonds in the chemical nature, and these hydrogen bonds that are created between water molecules actually give them a numerous amount of different properties. One of them is the fact that ice, the solid form of water, is actually less dense than the liquid form itself, creating more environments like the glacials, etc. So more on the properties of water. We have adhesion and cohesion. First off, cohesion occurs due to the hydrogen bonds between waters being able to bond with each other, to bind with each other. And cohesion as a word itself basically means the ability to bind with each other. So the cohesive property of water entails its ability to bind with other water molecules instead of sticking to other surfaces, which is the ability of adhesion. And the cohesive force, although being created thanks to hydrogen bonds, is actually quite strong due to the hydrogen bonds being clumped up in water molecules, and despite their weak force, they're actually able to output quite the numerous amount of power thanks to their sheer size and numbers. And cohesive forces are also responsible for surface tension, which we see in watery environments. And surface tension basically makes it so that surfaces that are coated with water don't allow other organisms or other objects to simply go inside them, and it creates this outer layer that blocks most objects to enter the water. Adhesion is the other part of cohesion, and adhesion, as stated before, is basically water's ability to bind to other surfaces, but the catch is these surfaces have to be polar or have polar character in at least one way or another. So polar character, for example, is salt. Although the sodium atoms in salt are non-polar, the chlorine atoms in salt are actually polar, which create the adhesive property, and that we'll touch upon this more on later, but this polarity is actually also part of water's ability to act as universal solvent. So again, just like cohesion, adhesion occurs thanks to the sheer number of hydrogen bonds that are created in between water molecules, and despite their weak force, thanks to their size, they're actually quite strong and create this very strong property that allows water to stick to other surfaces. Capillary reaction is basically a fusion of both these properties. It uses both cohesion and adhesion to its benefit. And an example of a capillary reaction could be the straws that we use to extract liquids from drinks, or the xylem in plants, which allow the transport of water throughout the plant itself. The solid properties of water actually occur thanks to water's polar character. The polar character of water allows it to solve other polar molecules or slightly polar molecules. As stated earlier, substances like salt are actually able to solve in water thanks to the slightly polar character of salt, thanks to the chlorine atoms in it. The polar character of water is actually able to interfere with these other polar molecules. So what it does is basically it cancels out the intramolecular forces in these substances, which causes them to dissolve and break down inside water. Thanks to this property, metabolic reactions and cellular diffusion actually occur thanks to the solvent properties of water, as the substances used in these reactions are usually polar, such as glucose. And the diffusion character itself occurs thanks to the high water content in cells, allowing the water to basically shine its solvent properties to their full extent. Substances that are polar and can perform both adhesion and cohesion are also known as hydrophilic substances. Substances that cannot fit this category are known as hydrophobic substances. An example to a hydrophobic substance is lipids, and an example to polar hydrophilic substances could be sugar or glucose in general. The solvent properties of water can actually be used in transportation as well. By transportation, we mean the transportation of substances in mediums such as blood. Blood plasma, as we all know, is composed of 95% water, which allows it to act as a universal solvent for many substances alike. As mentioned earlier, substances such as glucose and amino acids are both polar, allowing them to be dissolved in blood and be carried throughout the body. However, as we all know, aerobic respiration requires a lot of oxygen, and oxygen molecules are actually non-polar, which cause an issue when transporting them through the blood. And to get around this issue, the oxygen that have been carried throughout the blood can actually be carried without any other mediums, as in lower quantities, oxygen is actually soluble in water, but as we get to higher concentrations and quantities, such as the requirement for aerobic respiration, oxygen needs another medium to travel through blood, and this medium is known as hemoglobin. The hemoglobin protein, as stated before, is composed of amino acids, which are polar and can be transported through water. So the main purpose of hemoglobins or other proteins such as lipoproteins that are inside blood is to carry substances that are non-polar that still have to be carried throughout blood for transport purposes. The thermal properties of water actually come in many forms. Water actually has a very high heat capacity, fusion, and vaporization rate. What this means is that it's very hard to change the temperature of water without putting much force to it, as the sheer size of hydrogen bonds in water molecules actually cause it to be very hard for these bonds to be broken one by one and cause the heat and thermal properties of water to be very high in general. Due to these very high properties, actually breaking water molecules and causing them to, for example, evaporate actually causes a lot of energy to be released. And this energy release actually acts as a coolant agent for many organisms alike. An example of this usage of water's vaporization rate is sweating. Sweating, as we all know, is a homeostatic purpose or property that we humans use in order to regain our stamina and to cool ourselves in general. So the main purpose of water in this equation is to be broken down into gaseous form and to release energy that then serves us as a cooling agent, which can come in many properties. And as stated before, it's very useful for homeostasis, and this is not simply a tool for humans, as other organisms such as plants use the same effect in their leaves to a cooling effect. Hence, we can also state that the low amounts of change in water's heat capacity actually allows it to be a very hospitable medium for aquatic environments to thrive. Obviously, for habitats to form, changes in habitats have to be at a bare minimum, and thanks to water's very high thermal properties, the heat change in aquatic environments are actually quite low without any further interferences. Hence why the aquatic environments can thrive thanks to the thermal properties of water. Thank you for listening.